Hey everyone, if you were looking for the 4th annual Red Fury Book Awards, I'm needing to postpone that video for a week. There's a lot that goes into that video, the green screen, the filming, all of the guests that are going to be on that, a lot more editing, graphics, that kind of thing, and it's not going to be ready in time for this weekend. So I'm going to push that to next weekend. But in its place, I have something that I know a lot of you have been looking forward to. I've been counting down my top 50 books, and I'm down to number 30 through number 21. And man, I'm about to gush about some really great books. Number 30 is The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien, which of course is the second book of The Lord of the Rings. I talked about The Hobbit in a previous video, and one of the things that I mentioned there, I had people predict, how many more Tolkiens do you see on this top 50? And the big question is, do you consider Lord of the Rings one book or three? I honestly went back and forth with it, and I decided to consider the Lord of the Rings 3 books because that's how they were originally published. That's how they're most of the time published, and that's how they're conceived by most of the population. A lot of us do know that it was originally conceived as one single book rather than a trilogy of books. And I do have an omnibus collection back here, but for the most part, people do think of these as 3 books. This is the first of 4 books on this top 10 list that are literally the middle book of a series that made my top 30. And that just shows that authors, it is possible to avoid middle book syndrome because at least 4 people did it on this list. The Two Towers is so good. When I think back about all of the things that happened in this book, there's so much that happens in this middle book, and it's not just kind of staging for the last book. Even though it's so old, I still hate talking about spoilers, but let's just say that a lot of our heroes are separated. So you get a lot of different kinds of stories. You get some introduction to some very important things in the series. You get a reintroduction of a character. You get to meet some really intriguing new characters. And it was just a joy to me. And it doesn't feel like middle book syndrome at all, whether you think of this as the middle of one big book or the second book of a trilogy. But I do love The Two Towers. You can be guaranteed that the first and third book are going to be in this top 30 somewhere else. Predict, which one do you think I like better, Return of the King or Fellowship of the Ring? Time will tell. Number 29 is another middle book of a series, but not a trilogy, but a 7-book series. The book is Wizard and Glass by Stephen King. This is the 4th book in his Dark Tower series. And it's a chunky boy, and it is a book that, for me, is my favorite of the entire Dark Tower series. A lot of people have different favorites. It seems like most people, their favorites are the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th books of the series. And for me, what I love most about this book is it cemented for me the main character, Roland Deschain, the gunslinger who's trying to find the Dark Tower. For me, this book is the book that elevated him from one of my favorite Stephen King characters to just one of my favorite characters in literature. This story is a framed narrative where we get the conclusion of what was going on in the Wastelands, and Roland tells kind of his backstory. He tells a story of when he was younger. He's telling his new quartet, his new found family, about his original one, his first one. And it's equal parts coming-of-age story, which is something Stephen King does so well. There's a great love story intermixed in there. The world building is just downright fascinating. And it's just the narrative that I just loved from the first time I read it, and then when I reread it later and when the later books came out. But Wizard and Glass is my favorite of the Dark Tower series. It is my favorite, one of my favorite Stephen King books. I'm not done with him either, but I do love this book. And no middle book syndrome. It's book 4 of 7, and it is my favorite of the 7. Number 28 is Swan Song by Robert McCammon. This gobsmacked me. This blew me away. First of all, I hate the tall mass market paperback, but that's about all you could get at the time. Another kind of thick book. I had been told that this book was very similar to The Stand by Stephen King, which is another one I'll talk about at some point here, a book that I love. Post-apocalyptic story, epic storytelling, great characters, and I agree, I can see the parallels, but it is very different. And the differences make both of these, I think, must-reads in my opinion. But this is a post-apocalyptic novel. you get to see how the apocalypse comes along, but most of the story is the survivors and trying to deal with the aftermath of this apocalypse. In many ways, the landscape is its own character, and McCammon's descriptive powers are just on point in this book. But even more than that, his characterization is super strong. There are such memorable characters in this book, not just the titular character, Swan, but there are some really, really great characters. One's name's Josh, so that's my name, so of course I like that. But this book, the thing that I remember most about this book is it ran the spectrum of bringing out different emotions from me. There were times I was angry and just hated some of the characters in here. There were times where I was just in love with the story. There were times that I cried. I mean, the whole spectrum of emotions that you could conceivably experience in one book. McCammon happens to do it here while telling a great story, and 100% stuck the landing at the end. Just a landing that makes you think about perhaps what happened after this book, but in a really good way. Swan Song is an incredible book, and I give it a high recommendation. I can't believe this is only 28 on my list. Number 27 is 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. Now, Murakami is a very polarizing author, and this may be one of his most polarizing works. I've seen reviews saying that this is his worst book that he's written, that it's repetitive, that it's boring, that nothing interesting happens. And then there are people that, like me, see this as Murakami's magnum opus. This is my favorite work by this author. I've read almost 20 works by this author at this point. He is one of those authors that you either love him or you probably just don't like him at all. And Murakami is an author that I do love. 1Q84 is an obvious riff on George Orwell's 1984. And it's set in Tokyo in 1984 and kind of an alternate Tokyo. Early in the first book, because this was originally 3 books as it was published in Japan. In the first part of this, or first book of this, you meet a woman who gets out of a taxi cab and basically finds herself in an alternate universe, Tokyo, with 2 moons, and everything is quite different. And we get, in the first 2/3 of this story, we get kind of these dual protagonists, her and another character that you suspect that their stories are going to converge at some point. You suspect maybe they're going to fall in love at some point. It's unsure at that point. One thing I love about Murakami is, for me, his otherworldly, often very surreal elements that he throws into his stories, they just cause me to just feel really immersed in his books. And that's one of the things I love most about reading, is when an author can just totally immerse me in what he's creating. And for me, Murakami does that time and time again. And this is just such a mesmerizing read that even though it was super long, I just enjoyed my whole experience with it. It's not entry-level Murakami by any stretch of the imagination, but I think if you do like this author and you haven't read this one, you at least got to give it a shot. I hope that you're not one that doesn't like it like a lot of other Murakami readers, but I love this book, and it is my favorite by this author that I do enjoy quite a bit. Number 26 is The Killer Angels by Michael Shera. This is an historical novel that recounts the Battle of Gettysburg in the American Civil War. It is exhaustively researched, and it's considered an historical novel rather than a work of historical fiction, because so much of the dialogue and everything is taken from first-person sources, writings from rather than about the people that were in the battle. So a lot of the dialogue is true to exactly what happened. This is a story that tells the Battle of Gettysburg from both perspectives. And I love the humanity that he portrays in this. Admittedly, it does start a little bit slow, but once this got going, this is another one that I felt fully immersed. The scene at Little Round Top where, I forget the officer's name, where he yells, "Fix bayonets," to try to hold that hill as the rebel fighters were coming up the hill. I felt like I was there. I love the kind of the conflict in one of Robert E. Lee's important lieutenants, who was seeing Lee make tactical mistake after tactical mistake. Because despite the narrative in the American South, Lee was an amazing general, but he wasn't infallible. And he did make mistakes here. And you see from the perspective of one of his underlings that he loves the man so much that he's afraid to contradict him, even though he knows he's making mistake after mistake in this battle. It's such a novel with such depth and incredible storytelling. And I know that there are further books that are by Jeff Scherer. I don't know if that's a brother or a son, but it's really a shame that this is all we got from Michael Scherer, because this was award-winning, Pulitzer Prize winning novel, and is frankly the best book I've read about the American Civil War, and I feel fairly well read in that era. But Killer Angels is dynamite book, concise storytelling, highly recommended if you're interested in a great work of historical fiction specifically set in the American Civil War. Number 25, Enemy of God by Bernard Cornwell, although I've heard people call him Bernard Cornwell, but I have trouble saying that, so I'm going to call him Bernard. Bernard Cornwell, this is the second book of his Warlord Chronicles. I honestly could have included all three of them on the top 50 list, but I try to spread things around as much as I can, but this is my favorite of the trilogy, although I think all three of them are 5-star reads in my opinion. If you haven't heard about this trilogy, it's probably my favorite trilogy not called The Lord of the Rings. It is a work of historical fiction with a slant. Cornwell tasked himself with asking the question, what if King Arthur had lived? What would the real story have been that would have turned into legends centuries later? So you get a very stripped down tale of Arthur. You get kind of Arthur the man, not the king. You get a lot of the other characters that are famous in the Arthur myth, like Lancelot. I mean, read this series just to see Cornwell's take on Lancelot, because it's so plausible. It's so good. And I just love the inventiveness of this trilogy, but the storytelling is second to none. Of all the authors I've read a lot of authors in my lifetime, he writes the best battle sequences, bar none. Nobody else touches Cornwell when that is present in this book. You're going to feel like you're part of a shield wall in the middle of some of these skirmishes. He's incredible. But beyond that, the characters are real. I love how he explains the things that became magic in the Arthur tale and kind of explains them away, and that you could see that, oh yeah, that would turn into magic, and it's so inventive. The reason I think Enemy of God is the best of the three is when I think back to the trilogy and I think of all of like the big moments in the trilogy, a lot more than a third of them happen in this book. At least half of them happen in this book. It's incredible. And you get the story told from perspective of someone who's not in the Arthur myth, which I think is the perfect approach for this. But Warlord Chronicles, amazing set of books. Definitely go pick them up. Enemy of God starts my top 25. Number 24, yet another middle book, and that is The Trouble with Peace by Joe Abercrombie. Abercrombie's voice in the fantasy genre is wholly unique. It's not just because of his grimdark elements, but it's just the great dialogue, the great characterization, and just the great storytelling that feels a lot different from anything else in the fantasy genre right now. Trouble with Peace is downright remarkable because it's a middle book that in many ways you could conclude the series. Kind of. When you get to the end of The Trouble with Peace, a lot of these great characters which you met at the beginning of the series, the first book of the Age of Madness trilogy, you see kind of their arcs conclude, and there's kind of a big conclusion, huge conclusion to this book. But there's a whole nother book after this. And what is incredible, and maybe because Abercrombie's kind of plotting is a bit unorthodox, is you'll finish this book knowing there's another book and have no idea where the story's going to go. And then you read that story and you realize, oh, yeah, naturally this made sense, but you have no idea going into the final book in the series where the series is going to go. I love Joe Abercrombie's voice in fantasy. The First Law trilogy and the Age of Madness trilogy are both favorites of mine. I would say arguably that the second trilogy, as Abercrombie's a little bit more mature as an author, I think is probably the better written of the trilogy. The trilogies, I should say. There are some great characters and the storytelling's superb, but this book for me is Abercrombie's best. And no middle book syndrome. If you like kind of his unique voice and you like just some of the most interesting characters and the character journeys that they go on, kind of, because it's Abercrombie, this is the best book that you're going to read of Abercrombie's, but you can't start here, unfortunately. So anyway, read Joe Abercrombie. Trouble with Peace is amazing, obviously, if it's this high on my favorite books of all time list. Number 23 is The Poet by Michael Connelly. And I don't do this often, but I'm happy to say I have a first edition that's signed by the author. Michael Connelly is the most consistently great author that I've read. I've read 40 books of Connelly plus a lot of short fiction, and he is 40 for 40. He cannot miss. His consistency is just incredible. And The Poet, for me, is his greatest book. It's his fifth novel, so he reached his highs early, but this is one of the best, maybe the best work of crime fiction I've ever read. The Poet is incredible. Most of Connelly's works follow an LAPD detective named Harry Bosch. This is set in that same universe, but this is one of 3 books that he has written over the years that follows a journalist. And the journalist here, his name is Jack McAvoy, and he's investigating a crime. The crime is that his brother was killed by a serial killer named the Poet. And one of the most serpentine plots that you will read, some of the best characterization in this genre that you will read. And the thing about Connelly is he's not one of those thriller writers that just gives you plot twists out of nowhere. There are always reasons behind his plot twists, and they're always plausible, but you rarely see them coming. And none done so well as here. The heroes in this story, or at least the people trying to catch the serial killer, are very compelling. And the Poet, as a serial killer, as an antagonist, is extremely intriguing character. Connelly's best, in my opinion. If you haven't read any Connelly, it's a perfect way to jump in. The Poet by Michael Connelly, one of the best crime thrillers ever written. Number 22 is Under Heaven by Guy Gavriel Kay. Now, if you told me that you think this is Guy Gavriel Kay's best novel, I wouldn't disagree with you. It is incredible. It does so many things so well. It fuses a lot of the things that I love in fiction. First of all, it's kind of a fusion. His style of writing is kind of a fusion of historical fiction and fantasy. Additionally, I love the Eastern setting here. There's only so many books you can read that are European-based settings, and I just love seeing different settings in this kind of book. This is set in a world that is based off of one of the dynasties in China's past. And the story is so compelling and it's so different. Without giving any spoilers, you have a main character who does a great deed. He does a great service to kind of humanity at the beginning of this book. And it causes him to be bestowed upon himself a very, very generous gift that makes him extremely important. So this person who is kind of a minor character goes on this huge journey across this fictional country, and he's a very important person. So you see a lot of people trying to pull political favors from him, trying to get him along their side, trying to just befriend him. And it's a really interesting journey. The political situations in it are interesting, but the personal situations are even more so. Some of the characters that he meets along the way, whether they're people that become part of his personal life or they are the people that are kind of the important figures in this world, it's such a memorable journey. And it's one of those that when I originally read Under Heaven, I didn't think it would end up being one of my favorites by this author, but it's one of those books that just, the more it kind of percolates up here, the more I think about it, oh yeah, I remember that. And the more I think about it, the higher my esteem is raised from this book and this author. And of course it's Kay, so the prose is immaculate. The establishment of the setting is incredible. The narrative voice is as strong as they come. I mean, it's a remarkable book. And it is basically a standalone. He did write a follow-up called River of Stars, which is set in the same setting, but I think about 150 years later. So it can function as a standalone. And I think it's probably an okay place to start with Guy Gavriel Kay. The only challenge for some people may be if you're from a Western nation and you're not used to Eastern naming conventions where the surname and the first name are flipped. That might be a little bit confusing to some readers, but in general, Under Heaven is a great place to start with this author, and it's just a great book in general. Number 21 is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. 15 or more years ago, I was teaching, and I saw all of my students had this book, and I asked one of them about it because I thought it odd that a lot of them would be reading the same science fiction book that wasn't like maybe a new release. And they were reading it for freshman English. And I was intrigued, so I immediately bought it and I read it, and it blew me away. And then I reread it a few years ago, and it blew me away even more. Orson Scott Card wrote something, in my opinion, really special here, because he wrote a story that is very much a straightforward kind of space opera adventure type of science fiction tale. But the thematic depth is very deep here. You get a great coming of age story here. You get so much in here that I can see just those classes, the discussions that they likely had about the things that happen in this book. But it's also just a great book. It's not just a book about themes. It has one of the best plot turns I've read in this genre. I've heard people say that they saw it coming. I didn't. And I sometimes see those things coming. I didn't see the big plot turn here. And even rereading it, knowing the plot turn and being able to really think about what that represented from a thematic standpoint makes this such a thought-provoking read for me. When this channel was young, I did embark upon and I read all of the Ender books, and in my opinion, none of them got up to the level of this one. So it could be a one and done and you would be fine. It's a fantastic book. One of the best works of science fiction I have read, and my 21st favorite book of all time is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. So my apologies, I realized halfway through this that my mic wasn't plugged in, so the audio is probably a little less than my last few videos. My apologies for that, but I would love to talk with you in the comments section below about any of these books that you've read. And I'd also love, a lot of you that are constant viewers here, make some predictions. What do you think's coming up in the next 20? I don't know if I'll answer your question with a yes or a no, but I'll definitely answer your predictions that I see below. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Till next time, goodbye.